I'll try to keep this really brief. I've been asked to introduce Mr. Dunbar, so this will only take a minute. I'd like to ask everyone a favor for the Dunbars. Since everybody knows them, and they might not remember everybody right away, they're going to have to look at your name cards sometimes. So just as a kind of a gesture of courtesy, when you approach all your friends whose faces you know well, first glance at their name card and then say hello to your dear friends. That way we'll have everybody doing it, and nobody will know who really remembers each other's name. Okay. So this is kind of fun. This is, I'm not sure where this comes from. It came from the internet. Somebody said it was Wikipedia. Somebody said it was Baha'i International News Service. It's a summary of Mr. Dunbar's life, and I just want to read this real quick. Mr. Hooper Dunbar served in Haifa from 1973 when he was called to the Baha'i World Center as a member of the International Teaching Center until his retirement in March 2010. He was first elected to the House of Justice in 1988 and then elected to successive terms. That is so accurate and doesn't tell the story at all, which is, typical of official releases. And that's why I get to talk today, because I really want to tell a story if I can really quickly. And I have to tell you, one of the frustrations growing up as a Baha'i is that we didn't have any sense of context for how new the faith was and how fresh these institutions were and how much everything was changing before our eyes and how experimental everything was. We thought there had always been auxiliary board members, there had always been counselors, the House of Justice had always been there, and these things, the feast had always been a little boring. This is just the way it was, right? So what I'd like to do really quickly, if you really want to get the best out of the Dunbars, you have to understand what generation they came from, what motivated them, and what the center of their life's love is. And so I want to back up a little bit and kind of tell a little backstory. It's a little unconventional, but I'd like to start the story from Shiraz in 1844. Okay? And it's not really a joke. There's two pivotal kind of events that defined the generation that the Dunbars grew up in, or really they served their beginning Baha'i life in, which was the 10-year crusade period. And of course, the initial period I'm referring to is the day in Shiraz when the Bab had his 16 letters of the living. Tahiri couldn't make it, and Mullah Ali Bastami was already getting pummeled outside of Shiraz. He had the other 16 gathered there, and he gave them a mission, a specific mission. Now, they had been coming and listening to the Bab every day. They were students of the Bab's faith. They had been studying under Sheikh Ahmed and Sayyid Kazem's school. They were deeply knowledgeable. They were in love with the Bab. They would do anything for the Bab. Yet this day was important, because this was the day when they became the dawnbreakers. They went from being students and apostles to having a mission. Okay? And the Bab gave them very specific instructions, and he sent them out to all corners of Persia. And because of this mission, and because of their passion, they, in 2 years' time, they effectively spread the message across Persia and did what the Guardian described as creating a wave of passionate inquiry across the entire country. Now, their mission was essentially the spiritual conquest of Persia. Now, this is very important. This is a very important event because it's a parallel to what happened later. Okay, and what happened later? If you fast forward, I'm gonna skip the Siyachal and the Declaration of Baha'u'llah and all that kind of stuff, and skip right to 1916, about 70 years later, when Abdul Baha begins to pen the tablets of the Divine Plan. Now, it's a set of 14 tablets. They were sent, the first 5 came across before the war, and the remaining 9 came after the war. And those tablets, this charter for teaching, together with Abdul Baha's will and testament, the two charters that kind of defined everything thereafter, those events created something in the Western world initially, and then the entire world. The Baha'is, who had been so carefully nurtured, suddenly had a mission. okay? And it's a mission we still share today, and it's what defined the idea of being the spiritual descendants of the Dawnbreakers, okay? So now let's move forward a little bit, because when these are in the last years of Abdu'l-Baha's life. He passes away a few years later. The Baha'is are grappling with what to do with such a weighty load between the order that was chartered by the will and testament of Abdu'l-Baha and the mission to spiritually conquer the planet, which was given in the tablets of the Divine Plan. Very few Baha'is had any idea what to do, actually. It was very overwhelming. And the Guardian actually held in abeyance the execution of this weighty plan for about 20 years, while he prepared the communities and laid the groundwork, using the will and testament to lay the groundwork for the execution of the Divine Plan. Now, it's in 1937 when the Guardian finally opens the first epoch of the Divine Plan with the 7-year plan. And this is the beginning. This is when the Guardian was 40 years old. And in the words of Rihya Khanum, she says, he stepped out like a general leading the army of light. And this was the beginning of the battle period of Shoghi Effendi's life. And coincidentally, 1937 is the year Mr. Dunbar was born. So that's where he comes into the story. All right? And so as we move forward, the Guardian, before launching the 7-year plan, he spent tremendous effort. In 1932, he gave us the Dawnbreakers, and he retranslated these core books with the core ideas that the Baha'is would need in order to be effective in this great crusade he was leading us towards. And he laid out all these smaller plans around the world. They all culminated together in 1953 with one grand 10-year world crusade to bring the Baha'i faith to every corner of the planet. Now, this is where we're at. When in 1956, Mr. Dunbar becomes a Baha'i at the age of 19, okay? He becomes a Baha'i in the middle of this crusade in which, by this point, the Baha'is have been almost raised up from infancy by Shoghi Effendi. He has shown them powers and potentialities and capacities in themselves they never dreamed that they had, okay? And at this point, the love and devotion for the Guardian was such that people dreamed about the Guardian. People had visions of the Guardian. People would do anything to please the Guardian. Okay, it's hard for my generation to understand and imagine how loyal and dedicated the Baha'is were to Shoghi Effendi at that time, and how he really was the general that was leading them in this battle to bring the forces of light to the world. So in 1957. The year after Mr. Dunbar became a Baha'i, when Shoghi Effendi passed away, it's very difficult for my generation to understand the grief and the sorrow and the pain that swept across the Baha'i world. But I do know the result. The result was that any remaining attachment that the Baha'i communities had to their prior lives and homes was decimated, and a huge wave of Baha'is got up, and as a final act of love and devotion to the Guardian, the year after he died, they pioneered all across the world and really started winning the victories of the 10-year crusade. And this, in the year 1958, which is where we're at in this chronology, was the year Mr. Dunbar, at the age of 21, abandoned his very successful Hollywood acting career and flew off to Nicaragua, having no idea what he was going to do, only knowing that he was going pioneering and he was going to do what Shoghi Effendi willed. So this is the backstory. It's the devotion, the love of Shoghi Effendi, the enthusiasm and excitement of the 10-year crusade that was the childhood in the faith of Mr. Dunbar, and I think defined that generation of Baha'is in their devotion to the faith and their willingness to act first, to get out there and put their faith into action. Now, the rest of the story is equally interesting. I'll try to speed it up a little bit. I know that it's been a long evening, but Mr. Dunbar was in South America for the next 15 years. He did a lot of traveling in the villages with the Indians on the Mosquito Coast in Nicaragua. Somewhere in the middle of his 5-year period in Nicaragua, the National Spiritual Assembly of Nicaragua was formed, and he was on the first National Spiritual Assembly there. In 1963, now this is his 5th year pioneering, In 1963, he traveled with the National Spiritual Assembly of Nicaragua to Haifa for the first election of the election of the first Universal House of Justice. Again, the message doesn't mention that it was the first Universal House of Justice, which is really neat because the first election of the first House of Justice was done in the Master's house. You can't imagine it having room, but apparently Rahia Khanum had the doors taken off all the rooms and it was opened up, and all of the National Assembly members crowded into this historical room to cast the votes for this historic vote for the historic formation of this historic body. And of course, I'm from Alaska, so I have to say, the Alaskans went first. It was alphabetical. So Don Anderson was supposed to be the first person to cast a vote for the first Universal House of Justice. Unfortunately, he did this thing Baha'is do, when they get up and there's a crowd, they say, "Oh, well, please, please," right? So Howard Brown slipped past him, and forever will Howard Brown be remembered as Elbows Brown? Yes. And this is very recent, okay? So Mr. Dunbar had already been traveling on behalf of the Hands at the time, had already, during the time of the Hands, they'd been having Mr. Dunbar travel because he was working so closely with the indigenous peoples in Nicaragua. He then was traveling through Canada and the U.S., meeting with the tribes and meeting with indigenous peoples in North America. And in 1963, after the election of the House of Justice, the Hands then asked Mr. Dunbar, and Marilyn also, then they were married by then, if they would be willing to settle in Bolivia, where there was a desperate need. And of course, they had been in an extreme hardship position, so they readily assented. And I'm not sure I still am trying to piece the details together. But Mr. Dunbar was then asked. Mahmoud Kamsi was Masood was the auxiliary board member for protection in the area, and he had to return to Iran because he'd run out of money. He was supporting himself, and so he returned to earn more money. In the meantime, there was no auxiliary board member for protection for the 5 countries there, and so Mr. Dunbar found himself being sent around. And he was already running around doing things when he found out later that he'd been appointed an auxiliary board member. You have to have him tell you this story. It's much better when he tells the story, I promise. So that opens another chapter. At the time, this is when there were very few auxiliary board members. There were 9 auxiliary board members I believe for the hemisphere. Wasn't that how they organized it then? And so this is a very small group with tremendous responsibilities. And he was, I believe, 27 years old at the time, 26 years old? Okay, he won't correct me. He was very young. And I guess some of the Hands at the time had asked, don't we have anybody a little bit older that can do this job? So they asked the same about my introduction tonight, so it's all right. So he had these tremendous responsibilities to deal with covenant breakers and to do covenant protection issues from the very beginning. And I guess the Hands were fairly pleased with him because 5 years later, he was appointed to the first round of counselors. When they created the institution of the International Counselors, he was one of the initial friends who were selected for that body. So this is, again, the message says he was a counselor. It doesn't mention he was on the first contingent, that he was the first round. This is a new institution. And it's not the last time, because 5 years later, in 1973, by the way, while he's traveling in Iran, he was visiting the holy places in Iran in 1973, when he received word from the World Center that he'd been invited to come and live in the World Center and be a founding member. There were 3 counselors that were chosen for this new institution, the International Teaching Center. So he got this news that he'd be moving to Haifa, and that was, I believe he was 37 years old now. I guess 30, I figured last time that 37 worked in pretty well. He was born in 37. He was 37 when he moved to Haifa, and he lived there for 37 years. So it was a great year. So he served in Haifa from, that would be, someone help me out here. 1973 until 1988, when he was elected to the Universal House of Justice. And then in 2010, he retired from the Universal House of Justice and began his fledgling art career. And that's the chronology. And I want to just add another quick layer, which is why I'm actually giving this introduction today, is that sometime around 1979, he began giving a series of classes at the World Center for the Youth. And I asked him once why he didn't start the classes a little bit earlier, because that's 6 years or so. And his answer was, well, Marilyn and I, we were the youth. What are we going to do? Start a class for the hands of the cause? Right? So when some youth started coming to the World Center, he began giving these private classes in which he would share with them just the gifts that he had gleaned from his study of especially of the writings of Shoghi Effendi. And this class grew over the years. It grew to dozens and then hundreds. And over the course of until 2010, someone tallied it up, and there was like 6,500 youth who had gone through his classes at the World Center. It's a stunning number. And I can tell you from my experience that class was the most important, the most pivotal experience of my life. And the reason was that Mr. Dunbar has a way of teaching in which he gets out of the way. He loves studying the writings and studying the writings of Shoghi Effendi, and he feels empowered by it. And he shares that with you in a way that you personally do it yourself, and you feel empowered by it also. To him, it's a spiritual adventure. It's an inner adventure that he loves and loves to share. And that's such a non-threatening approach that the youth cling on to that very quickly, and they love Mr. Dunbar. And a little bit too much sometimes. In fact, in 1988, which is where I come into the picture, the year Mr. Dunbar was elected to the House of Justice, I was a little kid who just arrived at the World Center, and I found an environment in which all the youth were deeply studying their writings. They were discussing the station of the guardianship, the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, and it was all this rhythm, this heartbeat was all with Mr. Dunbar's classes. Okay? And he had spread this love of the study amongst these youth, and he likes to tell the youth that give 6 months to the study of Shoghi Effendi, and you will never see anything the same afterwards. Okay, and so that's really what we're going to be doing this weekend. We're going to be giving 6 hours to the study of Shoghi Effendi, and it's going to be fantastic. I should let you go, but I have to tell you, in 88, when Mr. Dunbar was elected, the youth in Haifa are so possessive of Mr. Dunbar that when his name was called, the youth who were seated way up in the auditorium jumped out of their seats and applauded, and that was not appropriate. But they had this kind of personal connection, so forgive them. Rihi Khanum stood up with this glare like, that is not appropriate. But, youth have never been, well known for being appropriate, so be it. So anyway, I just wanted to say that it's a great pleasure of mine to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce Mr. Dunbar, because so many of us have been touched by his generous sharing of his own personal adventure in the study of the Baha'i writings. And he does it in a way that doesn't feel the slightest bit scholarly or academic. It really makes you want to take part in it. And I think that's a great gift. And I have lots of other stories, but I encourage you to take advantage of Mr. Dunbar when he doesn't look too tired. Grab him and have him tell stories. He has so many wonderful stories. I mean, Marilyn does too. Ask Marilyn about her mother's exploits in teaching in Honduras. Okay, it's amazing. So this is a real gift, and I just as an example, I in my life got a chance to shake hands with William Sears once. Okay, my little brother will never have that opportunity. The distance. I live on the edge of the generation that was the last to see the hands of the cause living. Okay? Mr. Dunbar is the last human alive to have attended a conclave of the hands. Okay? Our own ignorance of the significance of these events is the only thing that limits us from taking advantage of this weekend and asking really good questions. So I encourage you all to dredge up the good questions, corner him. I might not be giving this introduction next time. Thank you very much, and Mr. Hooper Dunbar.
You know, when you go to the movies, they show these coming attractions, and everything about what's going to happen in the movie is exaggerated, and then you go to see the movie and you say, "Oh, well, it's so different," you know. So having been told how I will give this weekend and how much you're going to enjoy it and everything, I hope you'll all be patient. The second thing is, I remember William Sears himself one day was with him in a group of people in Central America, and he said, you know, that these Baha'i conferences are especially good for developing your eyesight. You see, because, you know, you come up and you meet somebody who, you know that from the way they speak to you, you know them, and you can't look at the card. So you have to look at them in the eyes, and at the same time you have to try to perceive what their name is on the card. He said the other best thing you can do is, he says, take out a pencil and drop it, and you go down, and as you come up, you read the card. You know, oh, so nice to see you, Sarah. So we're involved in that this weekend too. Well, I'm sure our eyesight will all be improved. Now, how you do all of this, years and years of what was described by Chad, in 6 hours, I don't know, but we're going to try. And it's just a taste. It's really like a taste of the honey of the faith, so to speak, to draw close to Shoghi Effendi and to the vision that he infused into his writings. As some of you may have been aware already, or as you might have become aware in the book on the forces of our time, there's so many references to the energies and to the forces and to the dynamic character of the revelation itself, that when you start combining them together, associating them in your mind, you begin to see patterns of things that are so important. You have this burst of creative spirit in the heroic age of the faith, which Shoghi Effendi said then during the formative age of the faith was a dynamic element that gradually crystallized in the consciousness of the Baha'is and in the world into the institutions of the administrative order, which then those institutions serve as channels for a greater outpouring of the potentialities infused into the world by the Bab and Baha'u'llah. So this is just an overview of what we're going to do this weekend, is examine this a bit and hopefully pique your own or renew your own interest in going back and looking at the revelation and the writings of Shoghi Effendi from this particular point of view. And it's one that's very encouraging. I found it so encouraging that I used to give this course over and over again. And I hope that you will also enjoy the same benefits from approaching these words of Shoghi Effendi. We're going to have some breakout sessions that deal directly with the quotations, some of the key quotations, the root quotations, if you will, of the whole understanding of what's going on here. And so we'll have an alternating sometimes. What is it? Let deeds, not words, be your adornment. I always have to ask forgiveness after a weekend like this of talking too much, and doing too little. But in any case, we'll try our best with you, and we look forward to see you again in the morning. It's getting rather late now, past the hour for this meeting. And sleep well and have great dreams, and we'll see you in the morning. Good morning, everyone. Allahu It's a pleasure to be gathered with such a large group of friends here in Bosch. I have never spoken at Bosch, and I've been here once or twice over the decades, but never had an opportunity to be together with a large group like yourselves. So it's a pleasure. Last June, we left the Holy Land after 37 years, and Mr. Dunbar stayed there, and Hooper came to California, along with Marilyn. So in case you have any illusions about hearing from a House member what the faith is all about, that's not going to happen today. What you want to know is what every Baha'i should know, is that when you hear any Baha'i speak about the faith, I don't care who it is, except the guardian, but you're not going to hear him right now. The thing you want to do is compare it against what you know from the writings. So if you hear new ideas, you want to say, well, where is that in the writings? Or, I remember reading about that, but it wasn't quite like that. If you hear me make major mistakes today, please don't raise your hand, but come to me afterwards quietly and tell me that you got that one wrong. With that understanding, I'm going to, spread out and say all kinds of things based on years of thinking about the writings and visiting with their friends around the world. And I hope some of it will be useful to you, inspiring to you. The subject, the forces of light and darkness, is a major one in the writings, but this hasn't often been thought of in the particular focus that we're going to look at it this weekend. Or if you've studied it out in the writings, you realize there were lots of inspiring passages. I know in the early 80s I started noticing references to creative energies and forces and all kinds of characterizations of those forces. I pulled this out the other day just as a kind of a fresh look at the thing, because you've got the book, you can see what's in the book, but I wanted to add a few more items and overview that I'd come up with. Shoghi Effendi characterizes the forces or creative energies of the faith with words like transforming, resistless in their operation, outspreading energies, unleashed, released, working energies, tremendous deployment of these forces, notable consolidation of the same forces. Now this suggested something I mentioned briefly last night, the idea that in the heroic age of the faith, there was this terrific outpouring of creative energies from the Bab and Baha'u'llah, 2 successive revelations, nearly 50 years of divine revelation, which instilled into mankind, infused into our life, the life of humanity, a terrific potentiality for the future. This potentiality acts both within us and around us, transforming society, gradually moving humanity from where it was to some other place in a direct manner, but not identified as related to Baha'u'llah. You'll find passages where the Guardian identifies how these energies are transforming and working in institutions and activities parallel, but in conformity with Baha'i principles. And that energizes them in the same way that we're energized as we come in conformity with the writings of the faith and the commands of Baha'u'llah. So this is something that was released, and he says in this formative age, and the very nature of the title he chose for this period, formative age, the time when those energies are forming into visible entities, agencies, institutions, through which those energies released by the 2 central figures, the twin figures as they're called, by Shoghi Effendi, can operate more effectively in the world and can assist us in our task. Of course, they don't only become channeled through that, because they also channel through the individuals and through all the efforts that the Baha'is can make at any level. So he talks about the notable consolidation of these forces as he's writing through his ministry. He talks about how they're mysteriously released. I mean, none of us really understand how it is that the manifestation is present in the world, and he speaks words of revelation. He also speaks other words. Everything is motivated by God. We're told that everything they do with their acts, everything the manifestation does is confirmed and is the divine purpose. But there's a special quality to the Word of God, the revealed Word of God. And when Baha'u'llah revealed words of God, he usually excused the friends from his presence because of the impact. People would faint, and it was really just too much for anyone. He had a couple of secretaries, and they'd try to write things down for a while until they passed out, and then be replaced, and they'd sprinkle rose water on them and so on. They have made a few comments about how, being with Baha'u'llah when he was revealing was like being in the presence of the sun. Suddenly he would become illuminated, and you'd feel this terrific light coming from him. And Aga Jan says his words at such times were like peals of thunder rolling out over the earth. And he tried to capture these, and after he would sit with Baha'u'llah and add the words that he didn't get down, and Baha'u'llah would then see a clean copy and confirm it as the revelation. How is it that something spiritual in the nature of the manifestation becomes something physical in the form of a material sound emanating from his lips that then becomes black scratchings on a piece of paper that then decades and centuries later you pick up and look at, and you come into immediate connection with that original spirit released by him, which remains pregnant in the world, waiting for the attention and the focus and the love to draw it into your hearts. As he says, it is a mysterious process, mysteriously released energies. Also, he talks about they stimulate, that these forces have stimulated processes. And if you follow through the use of the word processes in Shoghi Effendi's writings, you'll see that they are the processes of the administrative order. And they are the first crystallizations of these energies. And they are the basis for the development and deployment of first the administrative order and finally its destined world order that it's preparing us for. He talks about that these forces will ensure the consummation of Baha'u'llah's goals. He talks about the thrilling deployment of these forces. And we see that when we read the lives of the great apostles of Baha'u'llah, the disciples of Abdul Baha, those that went out, the great, mostly heroines of the formative age who were teaching the faith all over the world in conformity with the tablets of the divine plan. He talks about the energies being generated, how they impregnate, how they are irresistible. Oh, God, help me to encounter these irresistible forces. Dynamic. They are ready to combat the terrible disintegration of society. They're of incalculable potency. Again, he calls them stupendous forces, mysterious powers. They're creative, they're directing, they're propelling, they're onrushing, they're driving, mysteriously released, irresistible in their sweeping power, unpredictable in their courses. We don't know really what's coming. And I think that if you haven't thought about it, in the course of this weekend we have some quotations from Shoghi Effendi which talk about how all of the destructive forces, the breakdown of society, is also directly related to the revelation. In other words, you've got these forces good for good and they're going out. If you resist them, if organizations resist them, if ecclesiastical organizations resist them, if governments resist them, it sets in process a disintegration of those realities. So we're seeing an immediate effect worldwide of resistance to the intentions of Baha'u'llah in some quarters. In other quarters, people are arising to try to conform to it. Next, he talks about being unpredictable, these energies, in their course, in the course it takes. We can't really see ahead. Although he talks elsewhere about the cause being fixed on an immutable course. That is, its destiny is fixed and immutable. We ponder about that. I think my own understanding is that we have the possibility of accelerating it and slowing it down, considering how the guardian would call on the Baha'is to arise and take advantage of the time and to fulfill whatever. And the House of Justice is doing the same thing with us. So that's there, but it goes on its course. You can go off course and lose the confirmations and lose the energies that you need and get occupied with the world and forget the whole thing. But it's still going to go forward. And it says, if the people don't arise, Baha'u'llah says, we'll raise up the pebbles, the stones. I think probably we're the generation of stones now, but we'll see what he does after that. Okay. awe-inspiring, that's for sure. Undreamt of opportunities are hidden within these energies. They're revolutionizing, they provide sweeping changes. They're spiritual, and he calls them revolutionary forces. They are upsetting the equilibrium of the world, thank God. They're throwing into confusion. Those movements and forces that are going in another direction end up in a total confusion. He talks about them emanating, these energies, they emanate, which brings us full circle round to the fact that each of us is an emanation, as the writings say, of God's creative force ourselves. We breathe because of that emanation. It is not a one-time thing. He doesn't create us like we do a pie or a cake and leave it to see how it's going to taste later. No, he actively is recreating us, supplying us with this terrific world energy, the spirit that is behind everything, identified in the writings as the primal will of God, of which Baha'u'llah in his inner reality is the author and director. And that energy that's in each of us is longing for matching our inner reality with the revelation itself. Meanwhile, we grow up, we have an education, we acquire different points of view, we borrow from our parents, we borrow from the society around us. Finally, as teenagers, God help us, we borrow from our peers. And then gradually we come out of that and work ourselves into an adult position, generally very materialistic in outlook. Now, how do we replace this prism, if you will, that we have for capturing the emanation that's in us and alive in us? For the bounty of God, Baha'u'llah tells us, it never stops for an instant. If you don't feel close to it, well, as Bill Sears used to say, if you don't feel closer to God than you used to, who moved? How do we bring ourselves into alignment with the emanation that is our birthright that we have, being a spiritual being? How do we come to realize that creation itself, the world of creation itself, the material world, is actually a form of spirituality, a spiritual force which has become this lower realm of existence, which we should, in one hand, we say, we see the writings saying it's a dust heap of a mortal world and everything, don't attach your heart to it. But on the other hand, if our vision is transformed by the revelation, it becomes the face of God. Everywhere we see the will of God operating, and the outer world of existence, the world of nature around us, is like a book. Abdu'l-Baha says there are two books. There's the book of creation, and there's the book of revelation. And God is the author of both these books, so they coincide perfectly if we get our heads straight. And each one, he says, has its chapters and its verses and its words and its letters. And he says the more that you study the book of creation, the more you will be inspired to understand the book of Revelation. And the more you study the book of Revelation, the greater penetration you will have into the book of creation. The whole world is a school that God has created in this way, that we might understand light by the existence of darkness. And that, of course, is very closely related to the theme we have this weekend. That it's by the darkness we come to appreciate the light. Abdu'l-Baha says, if there were no illness, who could describe health? How would the concept of health even exist? So, as much as we suffer with all of our shortcomings, they are a means of purifying us, of moving us towards a higher reality, of greater identification with this living emanation that is our own, if you will, our own divine personality, which is working its way out through all of the situations of our life. I think that he describes how these forces crystallize, these great universal forces, crystallize in this formative age into the makings of a new society. But at the same time, at the individual level, the energies of the revelation crystallize within our consciousness. They replace the old schemes that we have adopted. Now fortunately, we have an educational system, so most of us have learned how to read and write and appreciate things in that way. And then we come in contact with the revelation, we're able to absorb it. But we need to continually reflect on it, think about it. It has to become absorbed. It has to cancel out those limited views that we have acquired knowledge, limited knowledge. We have to replace that with the concepts of the revelation itself. And gradually, every one of those is a terrific force that multiplies within our consciousness and makes us see things in a clearer way and enables us to become changed beings. And in the writings, you're familiar with the term spirit of faith. If you have made an attentive study of the passages related to spirit of faith, you find that Abdu'l-Baha describes that if you have the spirit of faith, you have a kind of universal knowledge, you have access to the forces of the love of God, you're completely transformed into a new being. And by the time you get through the whole list of these quotations, you think to yourself, God, do I have any faith at all? This doesn't look like me. So then that's good. That gives you a bit of a jolt. And you say, wow, he says, the ones with spirit of faith are going to go to heaven and the rest are going to linger or something. I don't know. We don't like to say hell exists. All the old Baha'is used to say, there is no hell. And I remember teaching in Catholic countries. They were so relieved by that. Mr. Olinga came to Buenos Aires and he gave a talk. He said he'd been in Haifa with Shoghi Effendi, and Shoghi Effendi had said that Nasruddin Shah's sins and his deeds were so bad that when he died, he went straight to hell. And one of the ladies in the back of the room started fanning herself. I was translating, and I thought, what's going to happen next? And so I turned to him, and he said, and then the guardian said, and he's still there. The lady fainted right off her chair. Stop the meeting down. The forces of darkness are pretty real. We'll see in the materials we're going to look at this weekend that they do exist and that they do exert an influence even in the next world. But so one wants to generally use this. And Baha'u'llah kind of summarizes it all in one verse in the Hidden Words. He says, seize thy chance, for it will come to thee no more. So that's what we're here about. Let us think, what are we going to do with the rest of the time? Whatever we've done with the time before, never mind. In fact, if you're burdened down with all kinds of problems of the past and things that you've done, which say, well, if I were God, I would never forgive me. That's not your job. You have to let God be the ever-forgiving, the all-forgiving. You can't come up with something he can't forgive. Look, he was ready to forgive Mirza Yahya, who opposed the divine light in such a treacherous way, trying to poison the manifestation of God. He says if he turned, he'll receive him, and his grace of God will surround him. So we have to realize that we have fresh opportunities, new opportunities at every instant. Every morning we get up to say our prayers. Every day we think, what will we do? Can Baha'u'llah help me? Can I serve the faith? Can I find a waiting soul? Can I mention the cause in some significant way? Can I be on time to the feast? Can I attend the local assembly meeting with joy? All these things are there, part of it. All right, so we have the Spirit permeating the world, gradually transforming things. We have it permeating us, gradually transforming us. And then we have the instrument of the covenant to direct us in how we can serve the cause most effectively in the time we're in. And of course, this relates very much to what the House of Justice is guiding us in the culture that they've established since 1995, moving us forward with the core activities in our communities and all those things that you know. So we have revelation as the source and origin of creative energies as the first section here, which we're going to look at. And again, the characterizations of Shoghi Effendi with respect to the revelation makes a very interesting study. And Here you come to the beauty of a program, a search program like Ocean, is that you can go after terms and see them in their context throughout the writings. And that enables you then to get a further confirmation. There's different passages illumine different passages. At the level of the verses of God reveal the meaning of the verses of God. In case anybody thought they shouldn't study too much because there's lots of things to do, there has to be a balance in our life. Shoghi Effendi said between prayer, we'll come back to this later, but for now, just briefly, prayer, meditation, study, and action. 3 of these are internal to create in us the propensity to attract divine confirmation so that the action is effective, so that we have the greatest influence with the little that we have time to do amidst all of our activities. So this is important that we do study the writings, that we don't give up on ourselves. One of the Western pilgrims, American I must say, was in the presence of the Guardian, and the Guardian was talking about the Igan, the importance of studying the Igan. And he asked if they had read it, and one of the American fellows, he said, yes, I've done it. And a couple sessions later with other pilgrims, the friends who were there, the hands and different friends who were there could hear the succession of this. He said that there was a pilgrim here recently who said he'd done the Igan. He said, you can't do the Igan. You have to constantly read and reread the Igan. It's you're never going to finish with it. So this is the thing with the revelation. We have to keep going back to it. And recently I saw a letter from the Guardian advising one of the friends, saying that he hoped whatever else you were able to do, you would at least find a couple hours a day to dedicate to the study of the Word of God. How many of us give a couple hours to it? But when you think in our lives, all of us have gone to school for years. We've studied day after day, hour after hour, the history of the state we live in, or something about how our gut works, or all kinds of things that we study and give our attention to. History of mankind. Do we do the same thing with the Dawnbreakers? Do we do the same thing with the books of God that Baha'u'llah has given us? We need to attend to those. That's the only way to replace this borrowed system we have that we've grown up with a new, fresh outlook, so that we have a new way of looking at things. This subject, I think, lends itself a lot to that feeling of wanting to gain a new vision. And however many times we've been reborn, let's do it again. Let's have a fresh outlook on it. Shoghi Effendi, when referring to the revelation, he says, in the same sense, and you can find these passages, you can look them up to find the original sources. He says that the revelation is all-embracing, it's august, it's colossal, compelling, dazzling, divinely appointed, exalted, great, holy, impetuous. You don't have to wait for it. It's on you. It's at you all the time. Mighty, momentous, overpowering, preeminent, priceless, potent, soul revolutionizing. Stunning. We should somehow get stunned by it if we haven't thus far. Stupendous, sublime, superior, supreme, tremendous, unprecedented, vast, weighty, and wondrous. It's a revelation that was anticipated, it's imminent, it's dawning, it's newborn, it was expected, it's the latest revelation, it's an independent revelation, it's the promised revelations. Put all these things together, you kind of get a feeling of the vast importance and also the terrific vision of Shoghi Effendi as the clear-minded, holy, inspired interpreter of the writings. You know, Baha'u'llah has revealed this heaven of omnipotence, this revelation. He talks about, for instance, he says the Akdas is a heaven in which we have adorned with the laws and ordinances of God. But there is beyond these laws and ordinances that heaven, which is also described in the book. In other words, the themes, the great themes of spirituality that prevail in the revelation are there. And of course, throughout all of his writings. So how do we absorb this this vision? How do we penetrate this heaven in a clearer way and realize the central position of the revelation of Baha'u'llah in all existence? This is our challenge, so to speak. One of the quotes here, you'll be reading these quotes together, so I don't want to go on about them too long. Nothing short of a power that is born of God can succeed in establishing the oneness of mankind. When you think about it, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, the crystallizing of the revelation of Baha'u'llah into agencies and institutions really depends on the transformation of us as individuals, because it's the conjunction of us as individuals that form these institutions. Okay, the institution is greater than the combination of the 9 people of the assembly. It has promises that when it meets and what happens, it'll be transformed. But it's so important that the elements constantly be turning towards him so that they can become the kind of channels that the community needs, the servants of the faith, the servants of the community. And somehow we lose sight of that, and we bring our old practicalities from the outside world into it, and we argue, and we're short-sighted, or we lack faith, and that just pulls the whole process down. We have to, then we usually have a crisis in the community. If there's disunity, everything comes apart. Now, it's very important that we work in our own minds, in our hearts, and in our prayers to maintain unity with the purpose of the community, with the instructions of the House of Justice, with all of the things that we have, so that we can remain in unity. Unity, I remember Horace Holly, years ago, he gave a talk, The Hand of the Cause. He said that Baha'i unity is not a universal decision amongst the Baha'is to get along or put up with each other. That's not Baha'i unity. Baha'i unity is the transformation of the human heart with the vision that God has sent to us. And when we see that in each other, we're attracted to each other. And then we're forgiving of all of the shortcomings. I mean, we are all imperfect. If you run around looking for a perfect Baha'i, you'll tire yourself out, I think. So the question is patience with ourselves, patience with those around us, and application in the study of the faith so that our vision is renewed all the time, is refreshed, and we can go forward with the work in a positive way. Spirit itself is as we were describing, the creative energy of God that comes from God and exists, the bounty of God that surrounds us all, and the focal point of which is the manifestation when he's present in the world, and when he's not present in the world, he is the all-encompassing ocean of all of us. In other words, we are the fish in the sea. And some of the fish are foolish enough to say, what's water? I don't know what water is. Can you show me what water is? So this is the understanding of this from the writings is an important element in seeing how these forces operate. And this spirit, Abdu'l-Baha says, is one and universal, and it's constantly flowing from God, and generally is categorized into several different levels. And in distinct tablets, and sometimes in his talks, those recorded in some answered questions, for example, he describes them as the mineral spirit, and the vegetable spirit, and the animal spirit, and then the human spirit, and the human rational spirit, and then the spirit of faith, and finally the Holy Spirit. He said, generally they're categorized this way. In another tablet he has revealed in Arabic, he describes 14 levels of the spirit. And they start from when they get to the human level, they start with the basest, the lowest of the human animating spirits, and then it works up by stages until finally it gets to the spirit of the kingdom of God and the spirit of the dominion on high, and so on. Talking about how those spirits are characterized. When you read them, you say, this thing. Sometimes you hear we say to each other, "I'll see you in the kingdom." Okay, I hope so. Kind of. I don't know how that's going to be. When you look at the qualifications, this is a very serious business. We want to seize the chance, for it will come to thee no more. Okay, so those levels of spirit at each level reveal new powers and capacities, which build on the lower ones. So you read that the mineral spirit is the cohesive force that draws the elements together and creates everything of the mineral world. The whole physical universe that we have is, all of that is based on patterns which exist in the spiritual world first. Over and over in the writings it says that this world is a reflection of the world on high, of the inner spiritual reality. It's a vague reflection, it's a faint reflection. It suffices for us here, it's everything it needs to be, and we can see through it into the divine meanings behind all of the various actions of the universe. But it's still a reflection of something spiritual. So when we get to the spiritual world, that's the real world, he says, and we'll see it in a different way there. Now this cohesive power, which he says, also all of this is derived from love. Love is that the love of God for creation, the love of God that you become conscious spiritual beings. All of that is operating through the mineral system, then the vegetative system. The vegetable spirit, where the conditions exist, draws the elements out of the mineral and creates vegetative life and primitive reproduction. And then it moves on to the animal level, where actually these entities become independent of the vegetable world. They take on a sensorial life, first in very simple forms and finally in more complicated forms, all of which are preordained by God. We are a kind of creationist, but we're certainly not free chance evolutionists in our outlook, and that's important to understand in the writings. I don't think you have to bring it up in the Baha'i meetings, but you should know about it yourself so that you can understand the forces of creation. The human race was also all separate. It's had its evolutionary stages. It may have had a tail. It may have been a polywog. It may have whatever. It wasn't a polywog. It was a human polywog, if it was a polywog. But it's all evolved until, as an instrument of this higher rationality, the ability to exercise free choice. This wonderful gift that God has ordained for us, that in creation we can choose him rather than have him direct us the way he directs all these other lower kingdoms. They're under his direction. And that may be why sometimes we can contemplate nature and it's so inspiring to us. Because it is the face of God, if you will, around us. Everything is according to the plan of God, except what we've messed up. And the human race then has to see how it can bring itself into conformity with the patterns that have been set forth in the Revelation. It's a daunting, challenging task. Obviously, you see how difficult it is at the individual level. Now imagine at the collective level that this spirit has to work itself out and gradually grow and develop as an organic development. New things come out. In the process, the administrative order, Shoghi Effendi said, is like a growing plant. The seed of that plant is the revelation. The nurture of that plant is the blood of 10,000 martyrs. It grows as a growing plant, and eventually it puts out buds. And when it flowers, he said, that's the world order of Baha'u'llah. Same tree, a plant, a flowering tree. And he says, when that tree bears its fruit, that's divine civilization. The end of the process. The purpose of all the things that came before us and all of the things that we need to be doing now. In the human reality, when Abdu'l-Baha talks about health and so on, he says that the human spirit, this actually not the spirit of faith level, but the soul is which everyone has operating all the time, is the thing that puts tears in your eyes and saliva in your mouth and makes your digestion flow and all the other physical processes, your heartbeat and so on. That power is sustained by an inner spiritual power of the soul. And he says that as we conform to the proper laws of nature, our health improves. And when this higher soul is able to act on the body without impediment of, alcoholism or other problems with drugs or whatever it might be. It runs the body in a much better way, and the body then reaches the point and works with the reciprocity with the spirit and the perfections that it's ordained to have. He says this works through the sympathetic nervous system. He talks in some detail about it. So you have these impulses of the spirit, and you want to be sensitive to them so that your outer being is in proper order. Now, one of the great truths that is revealed to us in the writings, and particularly in talks of Abdu'l-Baha, is that when you discover the reality of some process at the individual level, you can also move it up the scale of the kingdoms or down the scale of the kingdoms. In other words, there will be things you can discover in the interrelationship of the animal kingdom that will have a bearing on spiritual understanding. So when the reciprocity between the soul and the body comes to perfection, you have health. Likewise, he says, humanity, society itself is a body. And the Holy Spirit, the Divine Spirit, all this force of revelation that's been released is the transforming and in a sense, the maintenance system for humanity. But humanity is out of touch with this world of God by having turned its mirror of its consciousness to lower things. And so it's in a mess. It's walking in darkness, as Abdu'l-Baha says. It's because it's out of touch with the world of God. Through the teachings of the revelation, the individual cells of this great human body, they begin turning towards divine reality. And then that reality reflects in the body of mankind. And that brings inspirations and brings new institutions and brings new developments and initiatives which will help the whole of the human race. It again goes back to our individual transformation, how serious we are about it, how much of a channel we can become to make a difference to the future. And of course, that making a difference to the future is making a difference to our future as well. Abdu'l-Baha says that self-love is so needed into the soul of man that without the prospect of some benefit, he won't take any movement. He has self-benefited. We all want to see that it's going to help us, and then we move. And gradually that movement becomes transformed because in that movement is a greater measure of love. And finally, the love of God is what prevails in the human reality, we're told, and that will change us to the point where then we'll do things that we wouldn't normally do. Sacrifices that we wouldn't normally make don't seem like sacrifices anymore. And we see sacrifice as gain, and we see martyrdom as a supreme gift. It's a very different point of view from what prevails in the world around us, but an important one that we think about. You know, he says, seek a martyr's death in my path. No, you'd rather die decayed with cancer or lying in a bed for months unable to take care of your physical needs. I don't know, we say, oh, those poor people were martyred and so on. Yes, that's true, but they also gain a crown forever. How much physical existence do you need, to effect this transformation? Now also he uses these illnesses at the end of our life to polish us in ways that we don't understand. I think you can see that. And he uses our physical illnesses in ways to polish those around us as well. There's a terrific reciprocity between taking care of ill parents and relatives and things like that. So we see this likeness of the human reality receiving the benefits of the Spirit, and it produces spiritual health, and then also it helps with our physical health. And we see how the life of humanity needs the infusion of the powers of this revelation that we're hearing about, of the forces of creative energies that the revelation brings, how that needs to permeate our Baha'i communities. And as it permeates our Baha'i communities, and to the extent it permeates our Baha'i communities, acts as a magnet and attracts other waiting souls to us. One of the sayings, and I haven't found it again. Years ago I heard it. The master said something, but I think it's true enough that we can all understand it. He said, if one tree in a forest is ablaze, how can the other trees resist? So when we say to ourselves, I can't find anybody who likes the teachings, I tell everybody about it, but nobody's interested, blah, blah. Where's the problem? The problem is in us, not in them. Become a blaze, a tree that's ablaze, and you won't have that problem of not finding anybody to teach. You'll have to fight them off. May it be so. What do we got? I wanted to read you something from The Guardian on this subject, which is not in the particular selection that you have before you. In an early letter, he said, in the body of man, which is the true example or parallel, the spirit, when in ideal control of the lesser parts of the organism, finds the utmost harmony throughout the whole body. Each part is in perfect reciprocity with the other parts. The commands and impulses of the spirit are obeyed by the body, and the body in turn, in its actions and functions, identifies and determines the expression spiritual impulses shall take. Again, the commands and impulses of the spirit are obeyed by the body and identify and determine the expression spiritual impulses shall take. It's a big subject. He goes on then to say about this, this is divine unity. And this law, being universal and found in every created object in the universe, has full application to the universal Baha'i organism made up of believers everywhere, which has been established by the manifestation of God. He goes on with certain caveats. He says, should we build up the administrative world order to a point of absolute perfection, but at the same time allow it to be hampered or disconnected from the channels within, through which channels the Holy Spirit of the cause pours forth, we would have nothing more than a perfected body out of touch with and cut off from the finer promptings of the soul or the spirit. If, on the other hand, the influxes and goings forth of the Spirit are scattered, diffused, and subjected wholly to the more or less imperfect guidance and interpretation of individual believers, lacking both the wisdom secured through consultation and also the lights of real unity which shine through consultative action and obedience thereto, a disordered and disorganized activity would be witnessed, which would dimly reflect the divine purpose for this age, which is no less than the establishment of the reign of divine love, justice, and wisdom in the world, under and in conformity to the divine law. Friends, we have in the writings, in the guidance that has been given us, all the answers to everything. Really, incredibly far beyond our capacity to really take advantage of them. But it needs focus, it needs attention, it needs returning to them. It needs a certain kind of a discipline, which the world around us tells us is not practical, is not efficient, and all kinds of things. We have to take time for this. And so that our thoughts are constantly renewed, the extension of our vision is amplified. You know, the believers that followed Yahya at the time that Baha'u'llah proclaimed his revelation in Adrianople, Yahya made a counterclaim. And some of them wrote to some of the other Baha'is that were following Baha'u'llah and say, how can you turn away from Yahya? He's the mirror of eternity. It was one of his titles. So Baha'u'llah dictates a letter for this believer to write back to the Azali. And he says that the mirror of eternity is the mirror of eternity as long as it's faced the right direction. If it faces another direction, all the light is gone. And all the praise and attention that was given, because the only praise and attention that comes to us is because of the light of God in us, not because of something we've generated on our own. And Abdu'l-Baha confirms this in a terrific statement. He says that the service of the friends belongs to God, not to them. Whatever we're able to accomplish, and this keeps us humble. I mean, whatever we're able to accomplish is because we've managed to situate our mirror in such a way that it reflects light. And at any moment, we may turn it another direction. Otherwise, as we turn back to the world, and then the light goes out. How to keep our mirrors faced in the right direction, how to have these confirmations, and realize that it is the assistance of God, the confirmation of God, of all these forces that are pent up. And Shoghi Effendi said during the crusade, he said not enough people were drawing them. It's under pressure. Practically any movement you take to serve the cause has this terrific confirmation to it. And we've seen that sometimes. We get in a conversation and suddenly we feel this rush. And we say things that we say, oh gosh, I have to remember that. I never heard of that before. Where did that come from, you know? We've all had our moments like that. How can we make this a more steady relationship? And that's the essence of what this course is about and the purpose behind the book. Thank you very much.